Welcome. In this video, we're going to talk about Ssangsu Geombup Samban Form 3, Part 3. You know the deal. I'm wearing this uniform not because the form itself is not canonical, but because these are mostly my own ideas and ways that I personally train and teach these forms. So that's why I'm using something that doesn't have any of the Federation swag on it. But with that, let's get started. Yeah. The first motion makes the most sense the more you think about the weapon theoretically that you would be using, right? So again, using a much longer sword, so like an odachi, as opposed to one of these these little wee lads, right? So with a longer weapon, you can really torque it and use this as a cover, throw a big cut, again using this also as a cover, you can keep him more at bay, cover, and coming back in for this. Now, granted, if we are using Ssangsu Gum, I wouldn't actually personally hold middle guard that much in reality, just because it'll be easier for someone to get a good, again, foothold on my defense if I were, because then it can just like smack it down, especially if it is a sharp sword and if the ground is not solid. I mean, still gonna be solid, but a bit more squishy, right? So like dirt, they can knock it down, try to embed it or something like that. And generally it's not gonna be good for me. So this is sort of like a combination of the theory behind Ssangsu, but also maybe still using one of these guys. It was a little bit more okay for me to be a middle guard, because even if it does get knocked down, it's not likely to fully like embed itself in the ground, unless if I really either let go in some capacity, right? But we're here, I sense or I see someone, again, big rolling diagonal, a nice big cut. Someone's either coming back in or I just want a little more distance, coming back in, cut, I'm coming back in, defense. So notice that I've gained distance with this motion, and effectively by the end of it, I'm still gonna be in this distance. So with the sliding to the left, right? That means I'm probably already in distance with the person in front of me. So the idea here is I see someone, I cut them, whether the shot was a complete miss, for example. If I fully miss someone, it does make sense for me to step back, have a warding shot backwards, again, giving myself distance, but then trying to get back into some sort of guard to negotiate with my opponent. We talked about this in part 2, the idea of a slide to the side, right? So if I'm engaged with someone, so granted, again, there's gonna be some video, part of the video later, we actually show this with the person, but you can imagine, just thinking makes me giggle a little bit. So if I'm fighting someone, I move to my left linearly, not even like around that person in front of me, they're probably not gonna just magically slide with me, and if I slide backwards, it's gonna slide forward, right? So the idea here is to regain your distance or a good fighting distance. So we talked about this in the previous video on Form 3, but although the form is very linear, here is also very slow, and we'll talk about a non-application reason to do that. But in reality, I would probably want to turn like in a little like more circular motion, so to kind of draw myself out and back into a normal guard. But why do those motions slowly? Because the most surefire way to win a match is to freak your opponent out. If I'm slow, they have no idea what I'm gonna do. Just kidding, don't do that. That's incredibly, incredibly bad idea. So if you're ever in a sparring match and you're just suddenly like doing this all the time, they're just gonna attack you. Don't think the psychological game for slow motion, because it won't work. But anyway, but the idea here is not application, but working on the actual conditioning of the body a little bit more, and being able to kind of suss out the muscle groups activated. So for example, without the sword per se, again, you can use the sword, again, think about like in the left hand, engaging mostly with the actual holding up, the right hand as a nice little trigger, being able to use both in conjunction for a nice focal point, but then using my, my glute, so my opposite glute, to be able to push myself in that position, and using my inner thigh and my core and my glute to slowly but surely bring it back in. Because if I use a smaller muscle group like my calf muscles, for example, or my toes or something, things get really wonky and they feel really weird, as opposed to a singular mass of muscle and like the limbs snapping into position here. So this is not about application per se, but is more about control over the body. So let's finish up form 3 with that 3 slides to the left. We can kind of incorporate the double steps back. So as is with the form, I'd be here. Theoretically, it would be just like slightly out of distance, right? I'd slide to my left, to my left, to my left. I'm going to double step back, and then I'm going to be out of frame. I'm going to throw a cut. So, would this happen on the battlefield? If I see my enemy over here, we're locked in combat, I'm going to slide this way, we're just going to naturally go to the left? Probably not. But similar to what we talked about in the last video on Form 3, is it's not necessarily going to be fully to our left here. It's going to be more about turning as you slide back. So for example, if we start really close together and we both take our steps back here, first of all, neither of us really gave up a strong position in the fight. We're still able to maintain some sort of guard while being able to actually now have a fun distance from which now I can now do something fun against my opponent, right? So that's the main idea, right? So again, not that doing this again would necessarily help, but if we're here and we're close in, again, instead of going just to our left and we just kind of maintain this guard, which would be really silly, we're going to slide back and on an angle. So now we can do one more just so we can kind of see it. So we're at a much better vantage point to kind of actually have some sort of normal interaction. Do you ever back away from your opponent? Sure, right? We sort of did that with this one, right? Where we're kind of turning around them to reset our fighting distance. To go fully straight backwards, just like going fully straight forwards, and we've talked about this in the past, usually triggers something in your opponent's brain being like, okay, they're making a move, I need to react kind of quickly and effectively, right? Versus this motion is a lot more subtle and it kind of plays with your opponent's brain a little bit more. So theoretically, if I essentially just run away, it's going to bait them to come a little closer, right? So it's going to bait them to try to attack me. Allegedly, I'm ready for whatever's going to happen. Then we can, engage and do all that fun stuff, right? So there are other reasons, again, reasons I've been told that I can see, I can sort of agree with, right? It also explains why there's been like a subtle shift in emotions. But let's take a look at how the form looked, at least the way I learned it, 15 years ago. This I don't mind to a certain degree, right? So once again, think about which muscle groups you're using as you're sliding back. Don't think about calf and toes. Think more about the back glute, using that kind of almost like shunt your front foot back. 1, 2, again, using both of the glutes and doing that again. 1, 2, and then switching and cutting. There was no key up before, as far as I know, right? It was a one key up wonder was form 3, but now we have 2. But we're also going to talk about that switch to reverse grip and all of that fun stuff, because why not, right? But the idea of very quickly getting your distance away as opposed to a very slow, deliberate motion, right? Because if I am too close, I want to minimize the amount of time they have to recognize that they could probably take me, right? So it's like, oh, too bad, nope, too bad. And by using the glute, if I needed to, I can quickly go back in for some sort of strike and be able to reverse the momentum. But let's talk about the way that it's been taught to me more recently. This shifts away from a 2 double step back and more into 4 single steps back. Not very dramatic change, right? But from here, notice I'm kind of throwing the ball of my foot back first and sink back. Ball of my foot, sink back for all 4 of those motions, right? So the way that's been explained to me is that this is more about making sure there's nothing on the floor behind you, which brings up a really interesting case. Again, if you think about where your eyes have been able to track all of form 3, this spot you actually didn't directly see. You kind of walked into it over here, so you actually don't know what's going on behind you. So if you spotted a rock earlier in the form here, there might be something over here, right? So the idea is, I don't know what's behind me, check, nothing too bad. Okay, check, and you're kind of just making sure there's like no divot or anything like that for you to trip and then fall back and then be stabbed oh so happily by your opponent. So I like that idea because it gives you a new perspective on how to go through a form. So normally we kind of just move where we've seen, but this is where a situation in which you know what's behind you, kind of have to be worried about that a little bit more as opposed to like if we're doing something more like in a dojang or a dojo with a very flat floor. You might be doing this outside, you might be doing this really anywhere. So keep that in mind. Now, specifically with the put away, I'm going to actually leave this to a previous video where I break down like 3 different ways that's been taught, the way that I prefer it and all that fun stuff, because there's a lot more nuance to it, and I've already talked about this I think in at least 2 other videos. I make a lot of stuff, so there's going to be overlap, but I'm going to leave that part out and assume you can kind of like find that and figure out like how to get into that position. But let's talk about like what we're doing there, right? So the way that has been presented is it acts like a cut, but it is essentially the chakgang or chiburi, right? So from here, you're cutting down with the force and angle of a proper diagonal cut. Again, theoretically, not in reality, but theoretically, forcing the blood away from your handle or towards the tip, where you can theoretically wash it off, wipe it off, etc. Right? So it's acting as if you're cutting, but you're not actually cutting, and then you're coming back in here and back. That sort of plays against some of our previous understandings, at least the way that the Federation kind of plays with things, right? So usually the key ups are either the first major movement or the last dispatching movement, right? So the last major strike, everything else after that is usually just cleanup or vibe check, a lot of stuff. So like that's where we do our focuses. That's where we do, especially in 6, where we have this huge long motion of just cooling down after the fight. So it seems a little weird that they've introduced a key up after telling us that it's not striking anyone down. So keep that in mind. So it's an interesting little dichotomy of like, there's the theory behind where and why we key up, and then there's the over explanation. Now, would I recommend actually doing what I'm about to tell you in an actual fight? No, don't do it. Right? But the idea that like thematically that I'm trying to make this kind of work and like why we're switching to reverse and all of that fun stuff, right? So theoretically, right, we've been working with the same partner for a long time. This is probably the same person we've been doing essentially all of part 3 against. I'm moving around. I'm going to interpret this part as bathing them on, right? So in a form, it seems weird to be engaging with someone and then you just finish. That assumes that like either someone else took care of them or something else, which seems kind of anticlimactic, doesn't seem to really vibe check a form, right? But if I'm here, I'm kind of like bathing them in. It's like, oh no, I'm running away. Oh no, I'm a coward. Like, come get me, right? And by having a posted longer or a long middle guard, even longer if you like the way they do it, this is a lovely target, right? So theoretically, again, probably don't try this, but if I'm baiting them to strike me down here, especially if I drop it initially, they could come down onto my wrist. Meaning, probably this is where the tip of their sword is probably going to be. I can flip, voiding that target and trying to cut them down with a single strike that way. Now, are there problems with that? No. It is the perfect interpretation and no one can deny it, but there are problems, right? So yes, the idea of voiding a target to counter, fine, right? Love it. Voiding it to go into a not as super powerful cut. So reverse grip cuts don't really have the tenochi or the squeezing power of a proper two-hand strike. It's mostly used for slashing, unless if it is a shorter weapon, you can really kind of whip it a little bit more. It's mostly used for slashing, as far as I know, in a short sword like this one. So it's not always going to be like a good finisher. so like the person's just kind of like right there being cut down and you're just kind of like, hey, and you just kind of end your form and go off somewhere else. So if there's a better interpretation, I would love to hear it because I want to make this sort of thing work. There's a story that I can kind of play with, but it's still like plot holes and all that fun stuff. So let me know. But that's the end of Form 3, right? So Form 3 is actually one of my favorite forms, again, because it introduces so many weird ideas, right? So highly recommend that you go through this form and really be aware of like where you're seeing and all that fun stuff. But with that, make sure you stay safe, stay humble, and keep training.